Praise be to Jesus Christ and welcome to Catholic Forum. I'm your guest host, Alan Dunst. Thank you for being with us today. And we hope that our little conversation here in West Michigan finds you wherever you are and draws you just a little bit closer to Jesus Christ through His one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Today we're going to be exploring a bit of history, and I think we can all agree that these are interesting times to be a Catholic, particularly in the United States. We've seen orders of nuns basically told to provide contraception to their order, and things that go against Catholic teaching and Catholic conscience. And one might be surprised to learn that this is not anything really new. In fact, there's been challenges to being a Catholic in the United States since before it was the United States. And so we're going to explore that today, and we have an excellent resource to help us do that, Dr. John Pinheiro from Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Hi,
Thank you so much.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Yeah. And just to give a little background personally, I did not know a lot of this stuff. I actually ran across it in a book that was put out last year called the American Catholic Almanac, which tells you the day of the year, and then it has a little snippet, and it had all these things about churches being burned and these violent acts, and I thought that's stunning. I did not know that. And then of course we have a second book that I'm in the middle of. And this one is called Missionaries of Republicanism, and this is by a guy named Dr. John Pinheiro. So far so good. I'm really enjoying it.
Glad to hear that.
We're just going to talk about the history of how Catholics have fared and had to deal with certain amount of persecution or segregation, those kind of things throughout history in the United States. So let's start way back. So before we were the United States in the 1600s even, as the colonies were becoming together, we think of ourselves as having a lot of religious freedom as being one of the hallmarks, why people left England. But in the colonies themselves, that wasn't always the case, was it?
Well, it wasn't always the case, and I feel as an historian we always have to be careful when we talk about persecution of Catholics or long subjugation or suffering of Catholics, particularly in the United States, because of course even the persecuted Catholics of the 1800s had more rights than black slaves on plantations.
Yeah.
In other words, so there's these relative scales, but when you talk about coming to America for religious freedom, this was John Winthrop's dream for the Puritans. But you have to remember that the title Puritan was about purifying the Church of England of any vestigial Catholic elements. Getting no bishops, for instance, purifying the liturgy of anything particularly Catholic. And so when we often look to the Puritans and the Pilgrims a bit before them to talk about religious freedom, they were most concerned with their own religious freedom, which they didn't have in England. And so the Quakers didn't have religious freedom in England, so they came to Pennsylvania. The Catholics didn't have it in England, and they were allowed to get Maryland, thanks to some political friendships and political goings-on in England in the late 1600s. But in general, we talk about the colonial period in America. These were English men and women, and England had a very particular and hostile form of anti-Catholicism, because Catholics were held at that point to be traitors, and much of that had been the doing of Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Henry VIII, who had separated the church in England from the Church of Rome and placed himself as head of the church. And so there's so much history tied up in it, but one of the keys I think for folks to understand is there's still such a connection between events in America and events in Europe. No matter how far away Europe was, and the salutary neglect that Edmund Burke later talked about for Americans to grow freely and prosper without the direct rule of the king. Whenever there were revolutions or convulsions in England, those almost always spilled over into the colonies, and oftentimes they spilled over in a very anti-Catholic way.
Interesting.
So, for instance, when there were rebellions against James II. Okay, so James II, this is what is the triumph of William and Mary over James II in the late 1680s and early 1690s, celebrated by orange parades in Northern Ireland. And observed in America by a rebellion in New York, which had religious overtones against Catholics, by a rebellion in Maryland where the Protestant settlers overtook the Catholic settlers, and a descendant of Lord Baltimore did not again run that colony until he converted to Protestantism, and then they were allowed to rule that colony.
Amongst the things that were part of this mode of operation in terms of religious freedom, they were like their charters or their, I guess, constitutions, I guess, for the states, often did not allow, in some cases, priests to practice in that case.
So in the United States, in the U.S. history portion. So I talk about this in the first chapter of Missionaries of Republicanism. I give a background from the Revolutionary period up through the 1830s, and then I take it in a lot smaller chunks after that. But during the Revolution, at least, there's many Americans fighting against a Protestant king, and religion was kind of pushed to the side. It wasn't that big of a deal. There were members of the Carroll family who were on the side of the American patriots. But in the wake of it in the 1780s, and something that maybe many don't know, it was John Jay, later author of some of the Federalist Papers and the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who pushed to have anti-Catholic laws passed in New York State so that Catholics could not hold office. So there was this tradition in England that thought that if you would have to be a bad Catholic to be able to be a good subject, or in this case now a good citizen of the United States, because your loyalties actually lay elsewhere. They lay in Rome. There was just something, there was a foreign element about you as a Catholic where you could never really be English. And the English had this view of Jews as well, that they weren't really English as well, but they had this of Catholics. And so John Jay did that, and Alexander Hamilton was one of those who actually pushed against it. So there was not unanimity among the founding fathers on this. But on until the 1830s, there were established churches in some of the states, like Connecticut, for instance. And so when the First Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791, just a couple years in, then during the first administration of George Washington, that was interpreted by nearly everyone to mean that the new U.S. government could not establish a church and therefore oppress the churches of the states or individual churches. So there were some states that were not going to have established churches, and there was a movement to disestablish churches after the First Amendment. But again, on into the 1830s, there were established churches and laws against Catholics in some places, and laws against others too.
Right. One of the interesting things is that in your book, you point to only a few years later, 1834, I believe, as being kind of almost a springboard into due to the influence of a preacher. Was it Lyman Beecher?
Lyman Beecher. It's a very famous religious family in America. Edward Beecher, Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, a very famous family. And Lyman was he was probably best known at the time and since for starting the American Temperance Society and a movement that took 100 years to succeed in prohibition in the 1920s. But that was something he started. But he also tried to fund colleges out west, and he saw Catholicism as a real threat to the Republic. And so one of the things I tried to do in the book, because I'm not just a historian, but I'm a Catholic historian. And so following the namesake of my school, Thomas Aquinas, you try to be as charitable as possible to the other argument. This is where you really find out truth and what's true.
Right.
Maybe Catholics were all scoundrels. Maybe they had good reason to persecute them. Let's find out.
Sure.
And so the best I could describe it is they were so sure, people like Lyman Beecher were so sure that Catholics could not be good citizens because Catholics traditionally had supported monarchies. They couldn't be good Republicans, in other words, good citizens of representative government, because they would inevitably take orders from their priests or their bishops, or worse yet, the real bad guy in English anti-Catholicism, Jesuits. And so the idea that you would allow them full rights, I compare in the book, would be like allowing criminals to roam free and just hoping that they would somehow improve themselves on their own, rather than locking them up and keeping them safe. So from the Protestant perspective, there was only religious freedom because they didn't allow Catholics religious freedom. So it would be like outlawing the group that's going to take away your religious freedom. So from the other side, then they didn't see that as anti-religious freedom. They saw that as a way to preserve their freedoms. And that was the argument Beecher proposed But really, the anti-Catholicism in America was pretty latent because there just weren't that many Catholics until high Irish immigration starting in the 1830s and 40s.
Right. We should probably point out that in the early 1700s, 1600s, there was only about 1% of Catholics, I think.
Okay.
Well, that's a figure that I've heard.
Sounds right to me.
Yeah.
I think that's a good statistic.
That's a
I'm sure
statistic
it's different state by state. But
sure.
Yeah.
Right. But as you mentioned, like Maryland, after being given to the Catholic leader, they lost that, and then promptly were kind of prevented from having some of those rights that we talked about.
But the church it grew very rapidly. It was the brick and mortar, I think, that started to scare people. The number of seminaries, particularly out west. The west then was Ohio. But heading out west into the early 1800s, the number of seminaries and dioceses were growing. And if you don't have homegrown bishops, and they're coming from Ireland, or they might have Jesuit bishops. So the Jesuits were very prominent at Georgetown at the time, for instance. And the Jesuits were these were the bad guys of childhood tales and school book grammars for many of the Protestant children.
Interesting. And in your book, you kind of outline how that westward expansion was kind of almost key in terms of that as you say, latent anti-Catholicism, and it certainly gave direction for it. So kind of describe that a little bit.
Okay, well, if you can imagine the country, as some Americans wanted it to just stay east of the Mississippi, and the British, when they had ruled the colonies, wanted the colonists to say east of Appalachia. I mean, the closer to the center of government, the more you can control the people. And so that's an old story, but the Americans had always pushed, when they were English and later as Americans, had always pushed west, seeing land and private property as the real source of prosperity and human flourishing. And I think subsidiarity, among other things, would agree with that and the importance of private property and flourishing. And so what sparked this is, what's the future of the country going to look like? So if Catholic immigration continues in such large numbers, some Americans feared they'll settle out west and they'll outnumber the people in the east. Or when people go out west, they'll be susceptible to the Catholic schools and monasteries and establishments being built there. That's why Lyman Beecher titled his book, A Plea for the West, saying that we had to save the West for Protestantism. And the reason was not simply religious, which is why I call the book Missionaries of Republicanism. Right. That's a quotation that comes from the same man who coined the term manifest destiny. Okay. And but you can't have a republic without Protestants, they thought. So Republican government. So in order to have representative government and civil and religious liberty, they thought Protestantism was absolutely necessary. It was a prerequisite for that. So too many Catholics out west, there goes your republicanism. There goes civil liberty and freedom worldwide. And the Pope was plotting all this from Rome with Austrian money. That's kind of the conspiracy in thinking about the West. The
narrative going on there. Okay, and so how did that play out?
So how did it play out? Well, so in 1834, you mentioned 1834, the first outbreak of violence was in Charlestown, Massachusetts, against an Ursuline convent and school. And Beecher had preached a series of sermons in the city of Boston, after which a mob came down on the convent and put the nuns out into the night and burnt the convent to the ground. And 10 years later, they were still trying to get it rebuilt, trying to get Massachusetts to fund it, suing the state for lack of protection. And that was in 1844, and a couple important things happened in 1844. One is the worst anti-Catholic rioting in American history in the city of Philadelphia, with two separate riots a few months apart. People were killed, churches were burned, schools, neighborhoods, Irish Catholic neighborhoods were burned in Philadelphia. Also that year, the Tennessee Democrat James K. Polk was elected president, and he was president then a couple years later during the Mexican-American War, which brought a lot of these anti-Catholic feelings to the fore, and particularly about the West, because who was really west of the Rockies? Well, it was Mexican territory at the time, at least until after the war. Right. So would Americans really want to annex that many Catholic Mexicans? Some Americans said no. Some Americans said yes, for a lot of different reasons. So that's the real story of the book. Is that Mexican-American War. And I see that as really the seminal moment in the growth of anti-Catholicism. So many of your viewers will probably have heard of the Know-Nothings of the 1850s, or the rum and Romanism and rebellion, the election of 1884, and later events on up through John Kennedy and even the present. But it's in the Mexican War that really this idea was cemented that America is this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. And the term Anglo-Saxon starts to be used more often than white to describe people who were, Northern European and of fair skin, because by calling them Anglo-Saxon, you can exclude the Irish, who are fair of skin and white. And so the terminology even starts to change during the war, particularly.
So I want to go back, because you mentioned the know-nothings, and some people may have heard of them, but some people may not have. Can we just describe what the know-nothings, or who the know-nothings were?
Sure. In the early 1840s, there was a party called the Native American Party, but it was a nativist party, an anti-immigrant party.
Right.
And they were the precursor to the know-nothings. And they kind of died out in the late 1840s after the war, after the Mexican War. And in the wake of the Mexican War, and in 1854, an event called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, trying to divide up the West, and concerns over slavery, among other things, shattered the only real opposition party to the Democratic Party, which was the Whig Party. And out of its ashes, eventually came the Republican Party of Lincoln, which failed in one election, then succeeded with Lincoln's election in 1860. But the other party that seemed to be poised to be the new and major opposition to the Democratic Party was called the American Party, more commonly known as the Know-Nothings. The term came from, I know nothing. What is your party about? I don't know anything. Kind of a secret society, kind of a feel. And they were very prominent. They were expected to take the presidency probably in 1856, but they didn't. And one of the good things Lincoln did was informing the Republican Party. He kind of took the know-nothings and a couple other elements of the old Whig Party and purged, at least for the time being, at least, the nativism. That is the anti-Catholicism from the party, to build a coalition. I mean, still Lincoln's election, Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in the South. He was only elected by northern states, hence the later Civil War. So he was not a member of a real national party that was present in every state as a Democratic Party was. But it was still enough of a coalition to win the presidency and the Electoral College. So that's the know-nothings of the 1850s. Anti-immigrant sentiment seemed more important than slavery until around 1857 or 58. If we read history backward, it doesn't seem that way. It's all about slavery through the whole 1850s. But really until that Dred Scott decision, which was the first but not the last time the Supreme Court thought it could declare who's human and not, and subhuman and less important and more important. But until that, many thought the American Party was probably going to be the new opposition in the two-party system.
Interesting. Going forward, then, what were some of the fruits or the effects of the Mexican-American War and the lot of Catholics in America?
With the Americans quickly left the Mexican-American War behind. There are many Protestant missionary societies who wanted to, as they said, go in the wake of the armies into Mexico and convert the Mexicans to Christianity. In other words, to Protestantize the Mexicans. And then there were those who opposed annexing any part of Mexico because it would have Catholics in it. And then those who said, well, let's annex all of it because then we can Protestantize them and that would be better. We can take the land, etc. And so all that kind of died out already by the early 1850s, because with the annexation of California from Mexico, all those missionaries and Protestant groups kind of turned their eyes from Mexico and towards Asia and the Pacific Islands and the West, and then slavery overtook things. So we don't really see the Catholic faith as a flashpoint or any anti-Catholic activity in a major way until the 1880s again. And the Republican Party tried to use that, again, against the Democratic Party, calling it the party of Romanism, meaning Catholicism, and rebellion. So they were the party who had brought about secession and had been the pro-slavery party, which was true. And they were the party who, well, later they were going to be the anti-prohibition party and the rum party, but Romanism. And that backfired, and Irish Catholics rallied around the Democrat in 1884. And the Republicans lost New York State and lost the presidency, and so it backfired. It can backfire too. So I wouldn't want to give your viewers the impression that the majority of Americans were virulently anti-Catholic and violently so. They may have, they probably knew their neighbors. Like Joe, he's a good guy. He's Catholic, but he's okay. That kind of thing. Most Americans just aren't thinking about this at any length. It's just something that seems to be there in American history and culture, and it just rises up from time to time.
Right.
Usually sparked by immigration, but in 1928 it was sparked by the campaign of the Democrat Al Smith, the first Catholic to run as a major party candidate, and the last until 1960.
So going to the Al Smith then, kind of what kind of things happened around that event? Because that would have been a fairly notable.
Al Smith was in favor of repealing prohibition, and so were his supporters. He was more of an urban person. He was going to win in a lot of the cities, and actually he started an evolution in the parties in his campaign of that year. For one thing, he helped get Franklin Roosevelt elected governor of New York that year. Franklin Roosevelt repaid him a few years later by taking the nomination away from him in 1932, but that's another story. And so he started a realignment of the parties, making a more urban Democratic Party. But he was also known to be progressive. I would categorize Al Smith as very much in favor of what you see in Rerum Novarum and that kind of work in terms of subsidiarity and social justice and workers and unions and all those kinds of things that we might think of in terms of a Catholic thinking about labor and capital in that time period, but also social legislation, the kind that Roosevelt would later use during the New Deal, and there would be attempts even farther. So the biggest issue of the campaign really was his Catholicism. So it was easier for Hoover to win. It was the first time a Republican had won anything in the South since Reconstruction, when all the Democrats were out and there were only Republicans. And so once the solidly white and Democratic South had disfranchised black voters who had all voted Republican following the Civil War, the states were just solidly and reliably Democratic. But through the work of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan is reborn in the 1920s, not as an anti-black suffrage organization, which is how it had started, but it reborn as an anti-immigrant, mainly anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, and still anti-black organization. And so they played a pretty prominent role. And some wanted at the Democratic Convention, there were moves to denounce them, and then some senators came forward and said, you can't denounce the Klan, it's a Protestant organization. They'll think you're just denouncing them because we're a Catholic party, but we're not a Catholic party, but this will make them think we're Catholic now if you denounce the Klan. There was a lot of debate. About that.
Yeah. As you mentioned, there's kind of ebbs and flows of issues that Catholics have to kind of face. And certainly the tide or the environment changed in the early 60s, as you're saying. John F. Kennedy, elected. And he certainly kind of distanced himself from control of the Pope all that.
He had to during the campaign. So it's 1960. He's facing the same issues as Al Smith, and so he went before a group of Baptist ministers in Dallas, and a lot of people were portraying his speech to them as saying, "Don't worry, I'm not going to be that Catholic. I'm my own man." And I used to see the speech that way, but I've read it many times now, and what he says in the speech is, if my conscience as a Catholic ever conflicts with my duty as president, I give up the presidency. But I don't think the two will ever conflict. But it's interpreted by most people to just mean, don't worry, the Pope's not going to run the show. I'm going to run the show. Right. And he still barely won. I mean, it was a very, very close election. But that he had to give that speech was an admission, as he says in the speech, that the real issues of this campaign have been obscured by religion. There were tracts and all the kinds of things. And you know what's being quoted in those tracts? They're going all the way back to the 1830s and 1840s and quoting things Beecher had said in the events of the 1830s and 40s. That's how far they reach back for the material in that campaign. The accusations don't change much. Catholics are unthinking automatons who simply do what their priests say, which would be nice if their priests were good people, but they're nefarious scoundrels controlled by a foreign element anyway. And if you wanted to know what they were talking about, you can't know because they worship in Latin. So they're very secretive. And sometimes they have conversations in English with their priests, but that's in the confessional, and you can't know what's going on there either. So there's a lot to be nervous about.
Interesting narrative there. As we come up to the present day, we don't consider ourselves a political show, but it was interesting that, for instance, the healthcare mandate, that it came down to really a Catholic from Michigan who kind of believed that there were going to be safeguards in that, that law that were going to protect Catholic conscience, that made that law, allowed that law to go through. And we're finding maybe not so much of that, and so we have nuns kind of fighting for their rights.
Yeah, and so the law went through, but we're talking about a mandate that isn't even legislation or law, the HHS mandate. And I'm no expert on that, but I do know it's part of an effort that I would date much earlier, but the sea change I see in anti-Catholicism is when anti-Catholicism went from being primarily an evangelical Protestant occupation to a secularist occupation around about the 1960s. And if there's any big change, Philip Jenkins talks about this in his book, The New Anti-Catholicism, and those of us in the pro-life movement know that as Catholics, our best allies are the evangelical Protestants, and they really believe what they believe, and they're very adamantly pro-life, and they love Jesus Christ, and there's so much cooperation between Catholics and evangelicals that as an historian of anti-Catholicism, it astounds and amazes me. My friend Dr. Jared Ortiz at Hope College, who's the Catholic professor of religion there, calls it the ecumenism of the trenches. In other words, we discover that what we have in common is really important, because look what we're fighting for, innocent babies, etc., and against the HHS mandate. There were Protestant schools who sued as well as Catholic institutions. So what's really happened, in my view, is that the First Amendment no longer applies because we do have a state religion. But because it claims it's not a religion, that it's this neutral thing called secularism, there's no defense against it before the Supreme Court or under the law, because it's all in the name of neutrality, religion's pushed aside. So that what it has become in current times is your freedom of religion is going to be reduced to freedom of worship. As your own private hobby. You're allowed to go fishing on the weekends. That's what religion is. But for Catholics, it can never be that. Religion is not our private thing. It's supposed to shape culture and shape people. We're called by the gospel to the Great Commission to be evangelical.
So it's definitely a time of where you've got to be really Catholic to be to be Catholic, and they're going to be called out and called upon to go against the stream a little bit more than,
And people need that. The secularism is very alluring. These watered down versions of Christianity that become a weak humanitarianism or an environmentalism or any other ideological ism, they could be very alluring, or politicizing the religion into thinking that if you have this program and that law, somehow you've been a good Catholic, now you can go home. But we're called to the new evangelization, and we're called to live lives that inspire other people to love Jesus more. I mean, that's what we're called to do.
Well, unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank you for being with us. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And it certainly calls us to be more salt and light as Catholics, and be proud of our heritage, of our patrimony, of the treasures of faith that we have. So we hope that you found this interesting as well, and that you take some pride in your Catholicism, and don't be afraid, as John Paul II said. And we recognize that ultimately Jesus is the victor, and so just stay strong. We'll be praying for you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.